Bit of an update on the Riley. I haven't been doing too much. Things are a bit slow at the moment as I'm going through the process of trying to get the little Austin 7 on the road. So that's taking up quite a bit of time. But I have been slowly cleaning up parts for the Riley. So the rear axle casing has all been cleaned up. I want to get a coat of paint on that as soon as possible, but today's not a very good day for painting. I cleaned up the rear axle cover, and then the idea is I'm going to put the spare block with the gearbox bolted in back in the car so I can bolt up the torque tube and then bolt the rear axle casing to it to find the rear axle center line. And from that I can measure exactly where the front pin needs to be. So I'll figure out where the exact center of the axle is, measure from there back, find out what that distance is, and then probably just make that distance the same. I suspect that's how it's supposed to be. So I've been cleaning up bits and pieces of that. The half shafts need painting, and I need to put the wheel studs into those. The engine rotating parts should be ready to send off for balancing now, I think. I just need to think about this. I gave all the clutch parts and the flywheel just a quick coat of paint just to stop them flash rusting. And with that done, I should now be able to take the crank out of the block and get all of that balanced. This is a reconditioned oil pump, so that should be ready to go. I do want to do a test fit with the intermediate wheel to make sure the eccentrics all line up and everything looks like it's all going to work. The head, I've just repaired some of the slight pitting around the top just with some epoxy and then sanded that flat, just so that when the water necks and things like that fit in there, they've got a decent chance of sealing. I haven't ground the valves in yet on this because I've noticed on the head, hopefully you can see, around this stud hole is cracked, so I do need to repair that. I'm not sure, I think that one's slightly cracked as well. The middle ones are okay and the front ones are okay because they're a bit beefier. But it looks like this is a common problem because you can see on my old head that these have been repaired there, or at least beefed up in that area. It almost looks like braze to me. If I scratch through it, I wonder if that'll be bronze under there. So I need to figure out the best way to do that. Once I've repaired that, I can grind the valves in and start looking at reassembling the top of the engine. The chassis just needs those rear suspension pins still. I did end up from Tracy Tools in the UK, I ended up with the special die I needed. So it's a 5/8 16 TPI Whitworth thread, which I used to tidy up the threads on the ends of the pins here. I do need to get hold of some round steel stock. I think about 2.5, 3-inch diameter steel bar, so that I can make up the tapered spaces that need to go on the pins to account for the fact that the chassis rail is on an angle. So that's going to bolt through there with a spacer either side, so I can bolt it up really hard so that won't come off. The torque tube, I think I'd already mentioned, is over there. That's been painted. The rear drums have all been cleaned up and wire brushed, and they're all ready for painting, as are the rear back shells. I've got 6 drums to choose from, so I should be able to get a good set of 4 out of those. And I think that's about all really at the moment. And also I've done some work on the lathe, but I've got another little film about that. one of the small jobs I've done is, oh, that's a small dog, not a small job. I ordered a set of Mini-Lathe change gears. You can get these fairly cheaply from China. This was a 9-gear set, and it's the right gear sizes. I don't have a full set, but I've got most of the ones I need, and the bore diameter is smaller for the Chinese Mini-Lathes. I think it's 12 mil, and on the Emco it uses a 14 mil. So it was actually just a simple job to chuck these up in the lathe. I used a piece of aluminium wrapped around them so I could get a good grip on them, and just bored out the center to 14 millimeters. The really good thing about these is the little keyway on there was deep enough that I didn't have to change anything on there. So I didn't have to modify that at all. So I've actually now got the lathe set up with a set of metal gears currently set up to do 16 TPI threads, which seems to be the most common size that I've needed to do on the Riley. I think all the threads I've had to cut so far have been 16. So the set actually came with extra gears I don't think I'd ever use. So there were two 50 tooth gears. For a full set on the Emcomat here, I think what I'm missing is 25 and 55, possibly 65. There's a little chart on the door here that shows you the gears, and it's always really fiddly trying to get these set up. But this runs pretty nicely now, and I don't have to worry about stripping plastic gears. That was just my little test piece of wood I used just to make sure I had the gears set up the right way for the right thread pitch. Well, those run really nicely, they're not rattly at all, and they fit very well. So once I had the lathe set up, basically once you've got the zero position set up here, it took less than a minute to machine out each gear. So tiny little bit of setup, and then it was really easy to bore these out. Like I say, I got this as a set. I can't remember how much it cost. It wasn't ridiculously expensive. You can get individual gears, so I may see if I can get the individual sizes I need and modify those in a similar way to these, but I'm pleased with those. That makes the lathe a lot more usable. I've put the spare block in place. This is another reason the parts car I got has been very handy, because with that I got another engine mounting bar, which means I can have one block mounted in the chassis and another one mounting an engine to my engine stand. Without that it would have been a bit tricky. I have done a quick test assembly of the intermediate gear and the eccentrics which drive the oil pump. Nothing's actually bolted on here yet, so it's all just kind of sitting there. But this eccentric is actually driven, it's a separate shaft, and there's a pin on the intermediate wheel which engages with it, and you can see these little arms here that work the plungers on the oil pump. So as the oil pump turns, it's a bit hard to do with one hand, these little brass eccentric rods go around and around there, up and down at the end here to move the two plungers up and down. The interesting thing is there's different casting numbers on these rods. There seem to be a few different sorts. So I need to figure out which ones are the correct ones for my engine. Looking at it here as well, I'm not sure what holds that low one on. How all this actually goes together. So if I put that in place, so you can see the the arms move up and down, moving the plungers and the oil pump. And that all seems to be working, so perhaps those arms I've chosen are the correct ones. This is what came on the parts car. It's a different intermediate wheel. There's different marks of engine, and they're not all interchangeable. So this intermediate gear is different to the one that's on my engine, for example. But you can see the two arms there. I'm not sure what keeps this lower arm on here. Is there some sort of washer that goes in there or something like that? These are some of the other spare ones that I've got. And you can see there are different casting numbers on them. So not all of them even have casting numbers. So I need to figure out which are the correct ones to use. So that'll be interesting. I think the next thing I'll do, if I can find the bolts, is temporarily bolt the gearbox back onto that spare block, and then I can start looking at getting the torque tube in place. Another one of the little jobs I completely forgot I need to do, but could probably start doing soon, is the universal joint. So this has bronze bushes in here, and these wear out. So this is supposed to be lubricated by oil that comes from the torque tube. So this little plate, if you look at the mount on the torque tube, so this is what mounts the torque tube to the back of the gearbox. It also holds all of the brake mechanism, and the ratchet for the handbrake goes on here. And the way you're supposed to lubricate the universal joint is, if you look inside the ball somewhere, oh, that's the wrong side, you might be able to see there's a hole in there. This is actually on upside down at the moment, so normally, because this is captive, I had it wired on there while I was painting everything. So normally it goes that way up, and you're supposed to fill this little reservoir with oil, which then just drips down that hole and supposedly drips down and lubricates the universal joint. So this is the little cover plate that goes on top there. I'm assuming these little rivets would hold maybe a leather gasket. I'm not quite sure. Some sort of gasket anyway, I think goes underneath those, and that would bolt on there. So oil goes in there, just drips down through that hole. It will also lubricate the ball joint on the end of the torque tube. So you need oil in there. Grease is probably better these days, I'm not sure. So I'm not sure if a modification I should do is put a grease nipple in there somewhere, so that you can actually get grease in there. But where the universal joint is concerned, what I've been advised to do is remake the bushes so that I can take up any wear in the pins out of this engineering plastic. And I've completely forgotten what the plastic is, but it's one of those Teflon impregnated with self-lubricating type stuff. No, I've completely forgotten what the name of it is. But if I machine up the bushes out of this stuff, then this will all be self-lubricating, and you don't have to worry about oil getting down into it. I think the oil is also supposed to go down, this is the drive shaft, drip down the torque tube, and this is the center bearing for the torque tube. And I can't actually remember which way round it goes. I think it must go that way around. and the oil is supposed to run down there and also lubricate this, which seems like a bit of a stretch for it to be able to do all of that. Because mine's been shortened, I'm not sure I actually need that centre bearing. A lot of people leave them out, but I think I'll probably try and assemble it all with it still in there. And again, I may come up with an alternative lubrication system for that, some sort of grease nipple or an oiler or something. You can see though how that sort of bolts together and how that's going to work. So it is slowly coming together. So some Riley progress today. I've got the torque tube bolted up in place. I put the spare block and gearbox, mounted those in the chassis. I've mounted the back of the gearbox onto its proper mount, so the torque tube is in the correct place, and I've temporarily bolted the rear axle casing to the back of the torque tube. And I've marked on the chassis where the axle actually lies, which has given me a centre line for the axle. I had to measure either side as well to make sure that the torque tube was lined up on the centre line of the car. I've taken the rear springs off. I actually found that when I reamed the spring bushes, I used a hand reamer which has a little bit of a taper on it, so I hadn't actually gone all the way through, so the bolts were a bit tight. So I've re-reamed those out, and I actually used a machine reamer just by hand right at the end to make sure it really was all the way through. And now I'm going to take the rear axle off and paint that because it's a nice day, but figure out where the centre line, from the centre line measure back to the rear axle, the rear spring mounting points, and then transfer that same distance forward so I know where to drill the holes for the front pins. I finally got brave after measuring everything multiple times. I finally got brave enough to drill the holes in the chassis rails for where my rear suspension pins go through. So far I've only drilled them out to 18mm with a step drill, and I did try to keep the angle correct so that it's perpendicular to the centre line of the car. What I'm going to need to do next is I need a 3/4 inch reamer. I don't have one, so I need to ream those out to 3/4 so the pins will actually fit through. So that'll be the next job. I've also been trying to measure the angle here, so how much of an angle the chassis rail is on. It's about 7 or 8 degrees, but I don't actually have anything that I can use to measure it accurately. So this is where my 3D printing will come in handy, because I can 3D print some little blocks to use as sort of gauge blocks or guide blocks, and I can print those, 6, 7, 8, 9 degrees, and then use them as like a little, I'm going to say square even though they're not square, but a little gauge to figure out what the angle actually is in here, so that I know what angle I'll need to machine on the washers that go in here. And I can also 3D print those to make sure that's all going to work, and then I know exactly what it is I'm going to need to machine. I still need to get hold of some round bar, I think it's about 3-inch diameter bar to make those. The positioning of the hole, I went and checked. I had a look at pictures of original Brooklands to figure out exactly where the hole is. This line here is the line on the center of the middle 2 rivets, and that's actually below the center line of the chassis rail, and basically the pin goes right through the middle of the chassis rail. So if you look at an original, you'll see that the pin is slightly higher than the rivets, which is kind of interesting, but they're all like that. And as a second comparison, you can sort of look at where the shackle actually sits. So when you look at pictures of originals, that top bolt is just above the top of the chassis rail. I've seen pictures of some cars where the bolts actually rubbed on the body just at that point. So I'm pretty sure I've got that in the exact right place now. I also found that the axle eyes were binding a little bit, so I re-reamed those, and I think the mistake I've made there is when I reamed them out originally to 1/2 inch, I used a hand reamer, which I think has got a bit of a taper on it. So I just re-reamed them and made sure the reamer would go all the way through, and I actually finished them off with a machine reamer, which I believe is parallel all the way down. So I made sure that would go through as well, just by hand, and it did. So that should make the springs a lot freer now. The other things I've done today is I finally got around to touching up the damaged paint, the spokes on the wheels there. The guy did supply me a little bit of 2-pack that I could mix up to fix that, but in the end I just sprayed it with some gloss epoxy black, because it's basically the same color, so you can't really see where it's been sprayed. So that works really well for touch-ups. That's the rust knot paint that I've used before. It's basically the paint I used for a lot of the chassis and suspension parts on the Austin 7. It is very glossy though. So on the Riley, I've just gone for the satin black. It's just black engine enamel, just to stop these things rusting. So the rear axle casing had been sitting in my dilute phosphoric acid solution for about a week. I had to keep turning it around because I don't have a bucket long enough to, or a drum long enough to put the whole thing in. But that gets it very, very clean, and it'll just flash rust immediately. So there are some chemicals you can get that you can dip it in or wipe over it to stop that flash rusting. But I just went ahead and painted it. I much prefer that non-gloss finish. So the torque tube is kind of the same. It's just kind of no-nonsense black. A lot of pictures you see of original ones, they're just covered in paint, and I've never been able to figure out if that's how they were from the factory or if it's just that over the years they get repainted over and over and over again, and they just paint over everything. So things like the nuts and bolts, all the mountings, everything's just covered in paint. And it's a very thick, horrible looking coating, and it makes it hard to work on. So I prefer this lighter sort of coating. The good thing about the engine enamel is it's fuel and oil resistant, so it was okay to use on the inside of the axle housing. The head, I haven't ground in the valves yet because I need to fix the cracks on here. You may be able to see them. Apparently this is quite common. So apparently the best way for me to fix those is to TIG weld it with silicone bronze rod and then helicoil the threads. Apparently that works really well. You can see on this older head that it looks like it's been brazed or something there as well. It looks like even the whole corners have been done on this one. It's just sort of covered in this stuff. So I'll get hold of some of that and see how that works. And I'm still just puzzling around what holds the eccentric gear on the bottom there. I've just asked a few people who know more about these things than me. What else did I do? These are the brake pivot pins. So there's pins. This is one set. This is in the evaporus, so I thought that had been exhausted, but it's actually still working reasonably well. This is another set of those where you can see there's the pin, and this is actually a stainless steel bush, and then this goes into the back plates, the brake back plates, and the brake shoes rotate on those, I think. I can't remember exactly how that all works. I'm sure it'll become obvious when I have to assemble it. And because it's such a nice day, the weather was meant to be terrible, but it's ended up being a very nice day again. I took the chance to repaint or to paint the brake drums and the backing plates So these are all drying. That's just one side of them. I'll wait till that side's dry and then I'll flip them over and paint the other side, probably during the week. The other job I want to get onto is the universal and machining up the new bushes from the engineering plastic. So unfortunately that doesn't need any thread cutting, so I don't get to use my new fancy metal thread cutting gears, but that's another good job to do during the week after work. But it is slowly getting there. I think with those pins in there, I can actually start assembling things and try and get it on its wheels.